Spare. A trap. As Admiral Akbar memorably once announced, "It's a trap!" And it appears that Harry may have come across one also. He explains that his convoy in Afghanistan was joined by 3 journalists, and he was ordered to take them into the battlefield and give them a tour. However, there was a news embargo still applicable. He was in a Spartan, and the Americans were clearing the area. He was asked if they could get out of the vehicle to have a mooch around, and he said, "Yes, be careful of the mines." Everybody got out and started looking around. All of a sudden, they came under fire. And it was learned later on that the Americans had dropped a Hellfire missile on the nearest village, and there were many people that were injured. All of a sudden, 2 men were pushing a barrow towards the soldiers and carrying a boy whose apparently his leg was hanging over the side and had been shredded. They weren't able to speak any English, but it was clear that the boy was severely injured. Apparently, an interpreter tried to understand what was going on. Harry wanted to get a bit closer to find out what was actually happening, but a sergeant, who was a grizzled veteran on his 6th tour, suggested that he backs off because he wouldn't be able to get it out of his head, the extent of the boy's injuries. So he did. And then all of a sudden, they came under fire. Everybody jumped down and got onto their stomachs, apart from Harry and 2 other people. They were trying to work out where the fire was coming from, but the Taliban who'd fired at them were already gone. He was waiting for the ringing in his ears to fade away, and they were trying to work out what had happened. Some believed that the Americans had actually wounded the boy and they were genuinely seeking help. Others thought that it was actually a trap and that the wheelbarrow had been a charade to keep the troops immobile so they could fix on their position. And basically the enemy had done this to the boy and then used him as bait. And Harry wondered why on earth would they allow that to happen? And he was told that if they didn't, of course, they would be killed along with everybody that they loved. So, harsh dealings there for Harry. But an interesting little anecdote as to what he's experienced. What's interesting is he just details what has happened, but he doesn't talk about how it makes him feel. He just relays what actually happens. And that might be just stylistically what occurs here, that the ghostwriter decided we're not going to convey how Harry feels about it all, we're just going to do it. Of course, it's making a point, namely, why did the boy and the men go along with it? Because if they didn't, they'd be killed along with everything they loved. And basically, I think what Harry's trying to say there is, I went along with leaving the United Kingdom and moving to Canada and then California, because if I didn't do it, everything that I loved would be, in effect, killed. Now, somewhat dramatic, but that demonstrates his mindset once again. In the next chapter, Harry talks about Musa Kala, or Kuala, in the distance, and this is now February 2008. He explains that he was sitting in the back of a Spartan and he was taking notes off the radio. He was running the radio off the Spartan's battery, so every now and again he'd start the engine to give the battery a new charge, but he didn't like making a noise for fear of attracting the Taliban. He said that he couldn't get warmed up because the desert got so cold. He describes what he's wearing, and he was trying to pick up the voices, and he jotted down some notes, and then he heard that they make mention of Sea Squadron, and then he worked out that Red Fox was a person. And it sounded like Red Fox was going to be murdered. And then he realised with total certainty that Red Fox was him. And that the voices were saying that Red Fox's cover had been blown, that he'd been exposed to the enemy and needed to be extracted immediately. Harry was then taken back to when he was stoned at Eton, as you do, thinking about the fox that he glimpsed from the window of the toilet. And therefore he formed the view, so he really had been a messenger from the future after all. I mean, seriously, he thinks that a fox that he saw when he was stoned was warning him about the fact that years later he'd be in Afghanistan and his life would be at risk. No wonder this Ginger Bell End is so susceptible to the nonsense that his wife feeds him. He thinks like that. He then explains that they went on patrol the next day and he was particularly paranoid. And then special forces collected him. Their Chinook was escorted by 2 Apaches and they flew him back to Forward Operating Base Edinburgh. And then he saw a colonel in the green canvas tent. It was Colonel Ed. And he explained what had happened and that an Australian magazine had outed him and had told everybody that he was in Afghanistan. But then he explained some Bell End in America picked up the story, posted it on the website, and that got picked up by what he describes as the crawlers, and now the news was everywhere. He says the worst kept secret in the Milky Way was the presence of one Prince Harry in Helmand Province. So Colonel Ed told him that he was out. He explained that his superior had been pressing for some time to remove Harry, and so he'd been lucky in a way that the tour hadn't been shorter. He'd managed to elude the powers that be and also the Taliban. Harry considered begging to stay but could see that there was no chance of doing this, so he shook Colonel Ed's hand, grabbed his belongings and jumped back on the Chinook, which was waiting. Then an hour later he was back in Kandahar. He explained he showered, shaved and got ready to catch a big plane bound for England. It's hilarious, isn't it? Oh, big plane! I've got to catch the big plane! And the other soldiers who were going back to Britain were jubilant about returning. He just stared at the ground. And he explained that there was a hold-up. And the reason was that a Danish soldier's coffin was being loaded into the cargo hold. I explained everybody fell silent. And he then found 3 gravely injured British soldiers on the flight as well. And he spoke with the doctors asking if the injured men would live, and the doctor said he didn't know. And then Harry became angry with himself for being self-absorbed. And again, that shows that Harry has that sort of knee-jerk reaction to situations, but after contemplating matters, it demonstrates that the emotional empathy does exist with him. And, of course, he then explains that, of course, that the events, many people were in support of it, others were opposing it, some people didn't know the first thing about it, and how was it that they knew about it? And of course he concludes, of course, it was the press. So again, interesting anecdotes from his time in Afghanistan, although of course his tour ends up being cut short as a consequence of the disclosure that he was in Afghanistan. In the next chapter is his return to Blighty. Join me there.